these people at Harvard think that there's a new way to classify extraterrestrials and UFO phenomena. And one of those possibilities that they want you to think about, because it's not a research paper, it's more like fan fiction for UFOs, is that they could be magical fairies. Aidan said, "Oh, that's great. I know about fairies."
Oh yeah, I'm a big fairies guy.
So where are you, first of all, with the intersection of fairies and UFOs and aliens, and then take it away with your knowledge of fairies?
So when you got into the Nephilim thing, that reminds me a lot more of the Tua de Danann than necessarily them being the other things that have been brought up. But yeah, so when it comes to the concept of fairies, and I think why this is such a difficult concept for a lot of people to deal with, is that the term fairy in modern English tends to refer to things like you're going to think Tinkerbell. You're going to think of what's technically actually a pixie, which is a specific kind of fairy. Right. Fairy as a term refers to the fae folk, and the fae folk are a classification of supernatural beings. Right. They primarily come from the Celtic world, but that terminology spread over time. So with fairy, that can apply to a number of things. Typically in the mythology, you're going to look at people. I'm trying to think of the right term here. People, isn't it? You're going to see demigods, almost, called the Tua de Danann. They're also called the Tylwyth Teg in Welsh. Mm-hmm. They're not exactly the same. They inhabit a place called the Otherworld, which is not an underworld. It is a separate dimensional space. And this is why the portals thing was always interesting to me, with the Missing 411 stuff and the idea of time travel and things like that, because the Celts have a concept of time travel. Right. Like the Irish have stories about people going across the Eastern Sea and coming back hundreds of years later.
Really? Like old stories?
Yeah, we're talking about the mid-medieval period.
Incredible.
The 800s through the 1200s.
Real quick before you go on, do these cultures, were they believing in these stories? Were they more like mythology that they're sharing and they don't really believe in?
It gets a little complicated after Christianity becomes the dominant religion. Right. There was a process called Christianization where the way that they handled things was to go in and say not, oh, all of your stories are wrong, you should convert to our real stories. They would go and they would take, for example, the Celtic goddess Brigid, who in Wales and Ireland was a protector of women, a goddess of fire, those kinds of things, and they would make her the patron saint of women, the patron saint of protection.
Like a bridge into... into Christianity, like
so
for them to...
you get somebody is actually the angel. If you've got an avenging an avenging god, well, that might be Michael. That might be, oh, you're just misunderstanding. That's actually the Archangel Michael. It's actually the Archangel Raphael. Right. Because everybody has a concept of Christianity where it's like. Everyone's got we all have our Sunday school version of Christianity, and then you get into it and it's okay. Even within the first 10 books of Genesis, there's an entire epic tale that nobody gets to hear.
Break apart one paragraph.
Exactly. We did that. I took a class on Revelation in college.
Oh wow.
And our papers were on take this verse.
Oh, cool.
Analyze this verse of Revelation. Whenever people are like, oh, the world's going to end on March 12th, 2025 because this line in the Bible said so, it's like you have no idea how complicated Revelation is. Right. I don't understand Revelation.
It's amazing. Yeah, I don't either. And you can walk away with a different interpretation every time you read it.
People have been studying it for 2,000 years and nobody's come to a conclusion on what each individual symbol actually means. Nobody knows what the dragon will be, what the Leviathan from the sea will be. Some people are like, oh, it's Nero, and it's like, please just shut up, you're wrong. That's like the least historically reasonable thing to ever say, and theologically. But no, so in Christianity, you have characters like angels, right? And to be clear, I am a Christian. When I say characters, I'm using the literary term. You have angels. Well, that's kind of what we think the Tua de may have been, is that they were the lesser gods, for the most part, of the Irish. Probably also had counterparts in Welsh, Continental Gaelic, things like that. But we think that they may have been the gods of those religions that were turned into sort of these demigod, angelic, Nephilim-like characters by the Christian authors of the medieval period. We don't actually have any writings from the Irish. And there's a lot of people who think that, all the old pagan texts, all the things that Christianity is supposedly based upon, come from, were just destroyed by the Catholic Church. There's no evidence of that. Right. The Welsh and the Irish didn't even really write things down until the Latin alphabet got there. They did have writing systems.
Right.
They just weren't widely used
Yep.
because they did everything by oral storytelling.
And there's so much written in Irish.
Yeah.
That's not translated
and
outside.
it gets so much deeper too when you start to think about it, because the Druids, everybody thinks the Druids are like, magicians and sorcerers. They were really a general professional class.
Right. Interesting.
But they were their theology was deliberately illiterate. So the Druid class would not know how to read or write. And even once they could, even once it was like they had the option to, because you wouldn't write down the things that you didn't want the lower classes to know, and the class above you, the king, you don't want him to know certain things.
Right.
So they didn't want people to be able to get their hands on Druidic materials, read them, and then either pretend to be a Druid or to misrepresent Druidism, things like that you see with a lot of religions today, where it's like somebody will take text, bring it somewhere else, and say, hey, here's what this says. Now you all have to follow me. I'm a prophet of the Lord.
They'll remix it.
Yeah.
New translation. So how do we know how to parse through real Druid text?
There isn't any.
Nothing.
Even if
you find like the code or whatever.
There's a few scraps of a writing system called OGHAM, which is OGHAM.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a few scraps of that left.
And what does that tell?
Not much. I mean, we find it seems like it was mostly used for record keeping. There's not a ton of, they don't do theology texts back then. The Middle Eastern religions are extraordinarily unique in that sense. Yeah. Eastern Asian religion is just very different, but the Middle Eastern religions are very, very text-centered.
Right.
Whereas the Norse religion, they did have some things written down.
Right.
But it was all skaldic. You went to a bard, and that bard sang the story for you.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing in Celtic Britain. It was the same thing in Celtiberian Spain.
Yep.
They would tell their stories, even if they could write them down. It was more efficient to memorize them because it was so much harder to produce books back then.
Do you think
you're going to write down a book, but what's
do you think it has something to do with why people say the Irish are the greatest storytellers? As an Irishman, I like to think that.
There is definitely an incredible history of storytelling.
Seriously.
That came out of Ireland. And partially I do think because they were illiterate for so much longer as a culture than a lot of other places were. They really didn't start to pick up writing as a common thing, even for the upper class, until the Viking Age. Right. Whereas everybody else was writing before that.
It's crazy because so many of my favorite poets and authors are Irish. And there's there's this guy... I can never say his name right, but he wrote a book called that we translate as The Graveyard Clay, and it's just dead people in a graveyard talking, and it's amazing. Are we okay over there? Wesley looks okay.
He's working.
Wesley is hustling over there.
Wesley's a ghost in the
there he is. Okay, so then that said, when we talk about these fairies
the aliens
now,
and stuff,
how do you feel about them? Even these Harvard professors. Or the one guy's a Harvard professor making this claim. Do you think there's anything legitimate?
Can you read or can you summarize the claim for me again, really quick? Because I heard it, but I was kind of focused on this.
Basically, they're saying we should expand the way we think of UFOs and extraterrestrials, and they lay out basically 4 different types of classifications. One could be ancient civilization. Okay, there's what people have been saying. They could be descended from dinosaurs. Others would be magic fairies.
Right.
So the paper's long, and I have not read the whole thing yet, and I do want to, but I saw magic, fairies, and I'll try to find it and pull it up to read part of it.
Yeah, I'm just trying to. I have it over on Brave, but okay, crypto-terrestrials, intelligent non-human entities that live among us, time travelers from the future, parallel civilization.
Yeah, I like that one.
And magical crypto-terrestrials.
That would be where the fairies are.
Interesting. Harvard University's Human Flourishing Program. I'd have to read the whole study to have a really good opinion on this, but it almost looks like what I was doing 3 years ago with Missing 411 was like, is this just people going missing, or could it be one of these things?
Right.
I think it's a little silly to... I think when people say aliens, they are specifically talking about space aliens, you know?
Yeah.
Like they're thinking about extraterrestrials coming from somewhere else and landing here.
Yep.
And I think that's why this is striking me as weird. It's like, well, what you're talking about here is cryptids.
Yes.
You're not, or you're talking about time travel. You're talking about parallel dimensions. You're not talking about extraterrestrials. So why reframe that? If you're saying, hey, let's think about the possibility of other intelligent life outside of just space aliens. Yeah. I get that. And I'm wondering if that's what what they're saying?
It's
or
basically,
it's
yeah, I think it's like a thought project, a thought experiment to be
Yeah.
about, oh, we should start thinking about aliens as not just from space, but
is
from
it-
here,
Oh,
ancient
wait,
civilizations.
Okay. All right, I'm starting to say, I'm reading through this again a
Yeah.
little bit more. But okay, so it's more about the UFO aspect.
Right. And that the things they're seeing in the sky
Right.
might be these things. But again, it's not a research paper, although they reference certain, I'm going to put evidence in quotes because
Sure.
it's things we've seen that
Yeah.
may or may not be debunked, like the jellyfish people were looking. It looked like a
Yeah.
stain on a camera to me.
Yeah.
But people were talking about that. So they point to certain things like that.
Are you talking about the big black formless thing in the sky?
It was like by a military base.
Yeah. Was that real? Did that video turn out to be? Because I looked at it, and I was like, that.
I
If
don't
this
know.
is the only video of this that exists.
I know.
And nobody else took a video of it. That's CGI.
Exactly.
But if
So
there were
we're-
other people that took videos of it, I don't know.
So it's hard to obviously think about
Mm-hmm.
these things and say one way or the other. And I do appreciate that about this paper because a lot
Yeah.
of people have misinterpreted it, saying they're saying aliens live here. It's
Yeah.
more of a thought experiment.
Let's think about it. Like, why do
Right.
we always think about UFOs as coming
Fair.
here from space? Which
Fair.
I get.
And
Yeah.
it's also perhaps part of the rebrand with UAPs.
Yeah.
Which I don't like, but okay, fair.
So I have a weird theory on
Yeah.
that, which is that obviously unidentified flying object is physical, right?
Yeah.
UAP does not necessarily mean physical, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Right.
So what I look at that, I'm like, is the reason that that's kind of being reclassified because not everything that we're seeing in the sky is necessarily a physical object? Could we look
That's
at?
great.
Could we be looking at a sort of direct energy kind of weapon that they're testing? Can we just move a ball of plasma around
Right.
in the atmosphere?
I think it is that. I think that because fake clouds. We can get into that, but like I think they've broadened the topic.
Yeah.
Fair. And also, if you watch the very first UAP committee hearing from 2 or maybe 3 summers ago now, there's a part I always think is so interesting. They talk about UAP underwater, which is weird because it's not flying anymore
Yeah.
or aerial, but whatever.
Yeah.
And they go, we have to take that behind closed doors to talk about. I'm like,
Weird.
ooh, what's going on there? Yeah, maybe
But
mermaids.
But
yeah.
then I'm like, well, are we just dealing with like weird experimental submarines at this point?
That's where I typically go.
And this is not me trying to discount and be like, no, there's no paranormalness whatsoever. It's just I always take a line of like, let's try and rule out every possible explanation
As you
first,
should.
or at least consider them.
Yes. I believe there's a lot of strange things happening. We can't explain that. That might not be human. However, I always go to like it's Lockheed Martin building something.
Exactly.
And they got something in the moon, they got something underwater, and we don't know what. And that's something I've seen a lot of the people like congressmen talk about on that committee. Like, we're giving all this money to Lockheed Martin, no oversight.
Yeah.
Who knows what they're building?